What you see here is a shift in Apollonian decision-making throughout time. When the Greek Empire was established, it quickly turned into chaos. Within 100 years, they managed to make the whole world Apollonian, so all the world's leaders were part of this Apollo cult. So that was achieved. But all the way towards 27 BC, it was a big mess. Okay, even though you had the Han dynasty in Asia as an Apollonian region, things were still messy. In 27 BC, under the lead of this guy Gaius, they established the Roman Empire as the main administration of the Apollonians, and the other sub-administrations like the Han dynasty, the Parthian Empire, or the Mayan homogeny in the Western Hemisphere, they were all synced with the Roman Empire. And this went on until the 4th century AD, because this was going on. The east of the Mediterranean had a high population, while the west had a low birth rate. So the population in the west of the Roman Empire, it did increase a bit, but it was quite low and remained low. And that was an economic problem, especially for the British Isles. So eventually, this led to several economic depressions. So in 310, the Romans decided to shift the decision-making of the world from Italy towards a Greek colony, a Greek city called Byzantium. Byzantium was not directly located in Greece, but it was a Greek city. And today that city is called Istanbul. They changed the name. But from 310, it was the Roman Empire that continued through the east. The west still had its glory, but the west did not actually decide on anything anymore. So the early Roman Empire, or the early stages, were called the Principate. The Principate was a name that was used from the beginning when Gaius took over. And eventually the Principate turned into the Dominate. This was a more direct form of rule. Now, when the decision-making shifted towards the east of the Mediterranean, the West became like the ghetto of the world, and eventually the West collapsed. You had many criminals that raided here and there. You had Scandinavian bands, not whole tribe, just bands. So those, I don't want to call them refugees, but you had those gangs, those families that formed gangs that moved out, and the Roman Emperor in the east granted them land, and that's how the West was translated into Catholic kingdoms. So that's how that went. But eventually, the dominant was challenged by Islam that came up. And Islam became quite popular in the Arab world. So that was a challenge. And still, during this time, the west of Europe, or the west of the Mediterranean, both the west of Europe as well as the west of the Mediterranean, had a low population. So the west was still neglected. So there was a gap in the west. And because of this gap, the decision-making of the dominant over the world also fell in decline. So you would think that the Islamic world would take over, but no, the Islamic world itself was divided a lot, despite that it had many military successes. So you had many pirates from the Islamic world that began to terrorize Western Europe, and they went all the way to Scandinavia. And then you had this cult called the Vikings from the Vik province. That was an ancient province in Norway. They later changed the name to I don't know what it changed name into, but Vik was a small province of Nerikos. Nerikos is an ancient name of Norway, and later, during the dominant, we began to call Nerikos Norvegia, because Nerikos was a Greek name that the Greeks gave to the place. So they changed into Norvegia, and from Norvegia in the 8th century, well, actually still in the later part of the 8th century, the cult of Norwegians took over the financial and economic world of Western Europe, and eventually they overruled the dominate, so they became the decision makers. The Vikings established trade routes, they established trade connections, had their own financial centers all the way to Asia. They also hired many black men from Western Africa, including some black Moroccans, to work on their fleets. So that's why you have this thing called blackmail in the English language, because from the Viking administrative centers, they would send black men to Britain to collect taxes. And if the taxes were not paid, bad stuff happened. So they had to give mail with the money to those black men. So it was called blackmail. And throughout Europe, you had other places where they, for example, in the south, where they hired blacks from West Africa to serve in their military as mercenaries. For example, in Britain, you have the word knight that refers to not really a nobleman, but someone that's part of fraternity to guard the people. Now, it's called knight because those men were dark as night. Okay? So that was going on during the Viking era. There was one big issue with the Vikings, and that is that Norway, the base, Norway was unified, but Denmark and Sweden were divided. So this led to conflicts, especially because Norway had overseas possessions. Think about the Faroe Islands, think about Iceland, Greenland, and also settlements in North America, going all the way near Florida. So Norway was quite expensive. Not expensive of something cost a lot, but let me say they expanded a lot their territory. And the Danish, as well as the Swedish, this wasn't very well with them. So to reduce tensions and conflicts, the Vikings began to make Britain the place where they hid all their assets. So all their financial assets were relocated to Britain. They had their administrative centers in Norway and also Denmark, because Copenhagen became important, because from Copenhagen you could easily sail to Russia, to Poland, to German ports. So Copenhagen also became important. That was also part of the conflict, because a lot of people thought, you know what, maybe Copenhagen should become the center of the Viking world. But there weren't that many Danish people around. The Danish were the Danish people was very low in population compared to the Norwegians, and the Norwegians had more experience, so that was also going on. So by making Britain the place where they hid all their assets, they avoided a lot of conflict, because now you would have to go to Britain to arrange things. So Britain became the promised land for many back then. However, the Vikings had one big enemy, and that was the French. The French were Roman Catholic, who considered themselves to be civilized. They had this superiority complex in which they wanted the Vikings to disappear. But the Vikings were the decision makers in the world back then. Because Asia was a mess. Okay, Asia was an administrative disaster. So the Vikings were prosperous. But internal conflict and the fact that they chose Britain to locate their financial security, that became their doom. Because in 1066, the French conquered Britain, and within a week it was over. So that was the Viking era. The French didn't do anything. So this led to a lot of disappointment, because people expected that the French now would, that they expect a lot of the French, but the French didn't do anything, really. Yes, promoting homosexuality and all of that, worshipping the beast, but they didn't build their people up, except they constructed some churches, they constructed some monuments to distract the people, but that's it. As decision makers, they didn't really make any decisions, really. So, at the beginning of the 14th century, the Germans took advantage of this, but Germany was not one country like we know it today. It was like 60 or 70 administrations competing with one another. Nevertheless, because the Germans were strategically located as a center of Europe, and because the Germans had easy access to the Mediterranean as well as to Scandinavia, and because from Germany there were roads leading to trade routes to Asia, because of that Germany now became the decision maker. And most of what happened back then was that believers, those people that followed Christ without the Catholic Church, they were persecuted and often killed. But even then, not much decision making was done, but there was one thing that happens in the German era, in this administration, in this super administration called the Holy Roman Empire. There was nothing holy about it, but okay. The Blue Bloods in the 14th century, they want to reduce the population. So they began to relocate the food supplies, because back then you had no supermarkets, you just had extended barns or big barns with basements where they stored food. They had no refrigerators, so just used the cold air off the ground to keep food fresh for a long period of time. So the Blue Bloods had their mercenaries that took away food supplies throughout Europe and in Asia, because the Chinese Apollonian administration, or the Chinese Empire, which then was taken over by a Mongolian tribe, and eventually this guy, I believe he was from Korea. Some people say he was from another place, but anyway, this guy called Genghis Khan took over there. But anyway, during the German era, also in Asia, this was done to lower the world's population. And the shortage of food supplies led to starvation, but it also led to many bodies, or say corpses, rotting. And because many people had no food, they began to eat the corpses. So this led to many diseases. So people turned to cannibalism. And this led to epidemics of infectious diseases that killed off many people. In Europe, around 75% of the population died. Or at least a very tiny part survived. In Asia, there was also a large percentage of people that died, also in the Islamic world. So the world population was reduced within, I believe, 2 decades. And it was very traumatic. And there was one big problem with this. Because in Europe, most people died, and the people that were left were quite traumatized, the Germans were now stuck with a traumatized population, and many of the skilled people were gone. Many of the families that contained knowledge were gone also. So now, the Germans could not rule the world in an effective manner anymore, because they lost many of their skilled people. Maybe it wasn't such a good idea to starve your population and to expect the other Apollonian administration to do the same. But it happened. It was a very big mistake, and they paid for it. Portugal wasn't that much affected by all of this, had a lot of wealth, and they were sailing across the world. And they took over in 1444 when they approached West Africa. And that's where the transatlantic slave trade began. But they were not that deep into the slave trade because, well, the Lusitanians, or the Portuguese people, they were not that many. Maybe around 900,000 people. So their navy wasn't that big, and that's why they needed slavery, because they needed workers that didn't exist in their own nation. And many of the Portuguese people back then, I don't want to insult anyone, but they were a bit lazy, okay? So, that being said, Portugal took over as the maritime power of the world, and also decision making because they owned the money. They had a whole, what we would call, banking system back then that worked efficiently. So that was Portugal. Then late at the end of the 15th century, you had Columbus coming. Then you had Spain that began to establish their kingdoms in the Americas on the back of black slaves, of course, with the help of Portugal, but it was still Portugal that was making decisions. But eventually Portugal destroyed itself by its pride. And Spain, when I say Spain took over the administration of Portugal, but still it were Portuguese institutions that still were the key decision makers also in the economics. But the Dutch, meanwhile, who were at war with Spain, saw the takeover of Portugal by Spain as a threat to them. Because remember, the Portuguese were the decision makers, so the Dutch quickly built a huge fleet, and they became the decision makers in 1602. So the Dutch overwhelmed the world with their presence. With violence, they took over Southeast Asia, South Africa, Ceylon, which they would call Sri Lanka, also parts in West Africa. Many of the Portuguese settlements they took over. And, well, those are the things they were doing. So the Dutch had the biggest fleet worldwide, so they made decisions. Well, the Dutch didn't take that much advantage of it because they didn't invest in their own republic, and they didn't invest in that enormous navy of theirs. Which was quite dumb because they didn't invest eventually. It all faded away very quickly. When their golden age was fading away, this Bourbon king of France, Louis XIV or Louis XIV, attacked the Netherlands. And here's the background of it. Spain established the biggest economic zone on earth at the time, and Spain had an international trade, and the Spanish currency was worth a lot. The Spanish Empire went through some depressions due to inflation of the silver. Nevertheless, Spain had the biggest economic zone that connected Asia to Europe, and the Americas had no military conflicts back then. So the Dutch were really a hinder to the world's economy back then. So when the Dutch were attacked in 1672, within a day it was over. It was just over, and Spain was left as the decision maker. And the Spanish Empire was quite prosperous. In the late 18th century it boomed. However, due to shifts on mainland Europe, things also affected Spain. And Spain was a bit slow in some areas. So you had this Napoleon era that came, which caused a lot of dysfunction in Spanish America. Eventually, the Spanish Empire destroyed itself, and in 1826, Spain removed its lost assets from the Americas, except Cuba and Puerto Rico. And, well, 1826, let me say in July, August, it was over. There was no Spanish Empire anymore, and the British Empire took over. And the British wanted to whitewash all of human history. Now, this was resisted by many at the time. That's why Britain, in 1833, abolished slavery. And later, the rest of the world followed the same. And in the Spanish republics back then, slavery was also formally abolished. I'm not saying it was abolished in practice, but it was, by law, it was outlawed. And Britain went along with this because they wanted to take over all the affairs of the world, and they did. With the assistance of France, of course, couldn't do it on their own. This went on till the Second World War, and in the second part of the 19th century, Britain began to lay undersea cables on the bottoms of the oceans that led to the development of the telegraph, telephone. So they contributed to quicker communication. Britain invested in steamships, also in railways. So you had a whole industrial revolution worldwide. So Britain as a decision maker, made many decisions that shaped people's lives. And they were assisted by France because they needed a backup. So that worked. The United States of America remained a financial extension of the British Empire, even though they didn't want to admit this. After the Second World War, when Britain was in ruin, I don't say it was completely a wasteland, but financially it was a ruin. So, via the United States, the British investors continued their grip on the world's population by establishing multinational corporations. So, the British era actually continued via the United States, and that's how this modern American culture was fabricated out of thin air. And through Hollywood and later Disney, this was spread all over the world. So that was the Anglo-American era. The Anglo-American era was based on an economic bubble of the United States, because the United States made use of the assets of the British Empire. But the British Empire faded away very quickly in the 1970s. In the 1990s, the American bubble ended in Asia. You had the whole economic crisis in Asia then. And it was clear since the end of the 80s or during the 1990s, it was clear that the Anglo-American era would soon be gone. And the Islamic diaspora worldwide was the one increasing in both political and economic power. You had no Islamic unity nor Islamic empire anymore, but you did have a huge Islamic diaspora worldwide that was increasing both, and it increased both by birth rate, by having a lot of babies, and through converts. So it was clear that Islam would become the next decision maker. So the hoax of 9/11 was conducted. Well, I'm not saying nobody died, but the whole story of Bin Laden and all that is just a BS. 9/11 was a ritual conducted to lead the world towards the Islamic era. And, well, in 2008, it was clear that the Anglo-American era was gone. That's why Obama, during his campaign, was talking about change, change, change. That's why when Obama became president, he did a lot for the Islamic people, and he even reached out the hand to many Islamic leaders. Why did he do that? Because Islam would be the next decision maker, but there was still no Islamic country nor an Islamic power structure that was in place to actually do the leading. But still, the Anglo-American era ended, so now you have the Islamic era, except we're still in the transition phase, and there's still no Islamic leadership yet to actually begin to make the decisions. So that's where we are now, 2019. That's 11 years after the end of the Anglo-American era. But this secession phase takes a bit long because the Muslims are not that united, okay? So which Islamic country will take over? Is it Iran? Is it Saudi Arabia? Is it the Emirates? Is it Turkey? What is it? And between the countries mentioned, there's also rivalry and conflict. So we still have to see how this will work out. Just realize that it's the same Apollonian scam to keep the human population in a state of anxiety away from doing God's will. And all wars are scams in which real people die, and the trauma of wars are used to make the world's population comply with the relief seeking that they offer the population. This symbol, pointing finger, means you're one with Apollo, you're one with the beast. But they're all one with the beast, all of them. Here you see an X, which is Helios. Here you have the various sun symbols. And here's also a effeminate appearance on men to promote homosexuality. So, whatever the future holds, realize that Christ is a real king. And I don't know how many phases there will still come. Only God knows. We as believers have to just continue to walk by faith and realize every time believers are prospering and flourishing on the earth, the enemy comes with a retaliation. And the retaliation always backfires eventually. That's why you need all these shifts. But okay, that's it for now. Just keep agreeing with Christ and be at peace.